Can you tell us a little bit about how you came to be here at the Research Institute?
Well, I moved here in 1997, just after finishing a degree program at McGill in environmental studies. And prior to my time at McGill, I grew up in Rankin Inlet. So there was a lot of incentive for me to move back to Nunavut for my student loan, to pay off my student loan, and just because it was the area I was familiar with. And I miss the North. I mean, the Arctic really grows on one, especially if you grow up here. It is home. So I came home essentially, but to another location, and was lucky enough to get a job here at the Institute in an administrative capacity, and worked my way up to a licensing officer, and then into more of a program management, where I would help researchers plan field studies in Nunavut, help them identify partners in communities, identify and promote research needs of Nunavut communities to scientists. The Institute is a liaison, is a broker for collaboration on areas of importance to Nunavut. And our mandate is really how to focus science and traditional knowledge to addressing challenges and to improving social and economic well-being in Nunavut. So I've really enjoyed being involved in a lot of cutting-edge applied science, and we're at the Institute a source of advice and direction for some of the major Arctic science programs, like the Arctic Net program, which is a network of centers of excellence looking at the coastal impacts of climate change in the Arctic, for the Northern Contaminants program, which is a multi-year program focused on monitoring and assessing the impacts of long-range atmospheric transport of contaminants to the Arctic. We are networked through social science and health research programs, the International Polar Year. We at the Institute have been engaged in a lot of this work, and a core theme over the last several years, and I mean this is consistent throughout the Arctic and Canada in general, is the importance of documenting the impacts of climate change on the Arctic environment and peoples, like describing the vulnerability of communities to changing ecosystems, and the better understanding how to build adaptive capacity in the Arctic, in our communities, to deal with changing environments and all the impacts of climate change on our lives. And it's been often cited that the Arctic is, the bellwether of climate change. And we experience impacts stronger and sooner than other areas of the world. And indeed, a lot of our work at the Institute is to support research that better understands climate change impacts in the Arctic. And building on that, we are trying to develop our own capacity and expertise for real to conduct research in-house here. And one of my projects over the last 3 or 4 years has been to establish analytical capabilities here for water, to study climate change impacts on our water resources. I mean, it seems like we're surrounded by limitless amounts of fresh water in Nunavut, but in reality, a lot of our communities face water scarcities and shortages, and of their infrastructure in place to collect, treat, and distribute water is aging and breaks down. Kind of major catastrophes like in Panaktuk 3 years ago, when a major bridge was washed out, completely disabling the community's sanitation and water services. Similar incident in Alkviet, Nunavut, over the past year, where one of the community's water reservoirs failed, and so to supply the drinking water needs of local residents, the local authorities had to actually pump untreated water from a nearby lake and into people's homes. So you have aging infrastructure, changing climate conditions, which potentially could bring new microbes into our water systems and encourage the growth of bacteria and other pathogens. Changes in the timing and the patterns of precipitation and snowmelt and runoff, which recharges our reservoirs that supply drinking water. Changes in the dynamics of our hydrology, where you have more hot summers and more evapotranspiration, and ponds and lakes across the Arctic, and especially in the high Arctic, are drying up at an unprecedented rate. And water bodies that have existed for hundreds and thousands of years are now completely drying up. So how will this impact community water supplies? Is a major question where we need to, and something that is in need of a lot of research to better understand. So at the Institute, we started a program using a very simple test called defined substrate technology to measure levels of indicator bacteria like total coliforms and E. coli in fresh water. Especially, we're focusing on streams and rivers that people collect drinking water from using traditional means. A lot of our residents still prefer untreated raw water to chlorinated drinking water as their drinking water source. So over the last 3 years, we've used this new technology and worked with the students in Nunavut Arctic College to try and build some capacity here with support from Taiga Laboratory and Yellowknife and other experts to develop a test, the capability here in Iqaluit, in this lab, to run these tests. And we've found it to be quite successful and learned some valuable new information about the bacteria in our fresh water. And we're now expanding to partner with Dalhousie to do a comprehensive study of the quality of our wastewater systems and the effectiveness of wetlands to treat wastewater in Nunavut.
Having a lab here in Nunavut isn't the same as having one in downtown Ottawa.
Absolutely not.
What are some of the challenges that you find and the frustrations that you deal with?
It's incredibly challenging to run an effective analytical facility in Nunavut. For one thing, all of the equipment has to be shipped to us either by sea lift or air, and that's incredibly expensive. We also have we need chemicals to run effective testing, and acids like nitric acid, sulfuric acid, hydrochloric acid, and other dangerous chemicals that are incredibly difficult to ship to us here because they are dangerous goods, and the shipping companies, airlines, and have restrictions on how they can be transported. So basic supplies to run our analytical tests and to maintain and service our equipment are sometimes very difficult to bring here and very expensive, resulting in long delays. And for instance, we have a very expensive autoclave here that hasn't been serviced in several years because of the cost of bringing a technician from the company to Iqaluit to provide that routine servicing. It would cost in the range of $30,000 to $40,000 just to transport somebody and house them and pay for their services to provide the necessary servicing. And to be a credible, accredited facility, we need to have quality assurance and quality control in all our work. So in order to achieve those standards, we have to spend, again, a lot of money to maintain our equipment and bring in supplies. And we've sort of worked around that by identifying smaller, more portable equipment and techniques that work better in an Arctic setting, where that don't weigh too much and can be transported easily, that are easily serviced, that can be maintained and used by community members without 7 years training in a specific science field. And so that's sort of the approach we're taking for analytical science in Nunavut, to be community friendly and cost effective. I'll show you an example here that I don't know if you can see that this is a benchtop autoclave that we use in lieu of a much more elaborate model. Drawbacks: smaller capacity, so we have to spend more time using it to sterilize. but advantage. It can be transported here, maintained and serviced effectively by us. But the particular technique we're using for water is built around the idea of small-scale modular equipment that we can move into Nunavut smaller communities to perform the similar tests. We have a simple incubator, a little tray sealer. The water test results come out as very easily interpreted wells with the yellow color indicating levels of bacteria, which a student can easily read out and refer to a number table to get an estimate of the number of colonies of bacteria in the sample. Simple quality control measures, easy technical support from the manufacturer. So all in all, though, it is an incredibly challenging and very costly endeavor to maintain a laboratory in the Arctic, in Nunavut.
One of the things we've heard in dealing with any industries, any kind of infrastructure here, is on the human resource side. People are saying, you know, in some cases we have the opportunities for them, we just don't have the capacity. Been away, been trained, educated, and you returned. Are there things that you're engaged in to try and interest some of youth to actually continue in those and look at the possibility of having a career like yours?
Well, part of the college's or the Nunavut Research Institute's mandate is to provide support to the Nunavut Arctic College's Environmental Technology program, which is the only post-secondary program in environmental studies in Nunavut. So we have a very, we think it's very important to work as closely as possible with that program, and at every opportunity I bring in students from that program and demonstrate the techniques. And we have summer students every year from the program we hire to collect the samples and run the tests. And this particular technique is such a effective one because it can be learned very quickly. And so with a limited training, we can have a student with no background in microbiology implement the tests and the quality control procedures effectively and meet standards and really learn and enjoy the work. So it's absolutely critical to give that hands-on practical experience and provide the opportunities for students to see and touch and do. Our students learn much better in a practical, hands-on, experiential setting than just sitting in the classroom learning theory. And that's key to building that confidence and interest that would bring them into further studies in the South, maybe, or a post-secondary, and then ultimately into careers in science. But on the flip side, identifying people with backgrounds and expertise in lab management, like finding a microbiologist here in Iqaluit to run these facilities effectively and to bring it up to the level that it could operate is almost next to impossible. Just because of our resource limitations, because of just like the challenge that you mentioned earlier, in that we have so few people with the right expertise and skills that those that could do this job are making 10 times more working in the hospital. So we do the best with the limited people and resources we have here, but I'm very hopeful for the future because we are forming new and more effective partnerships with universities. We have Dalhousie University in here to conduct a 7-year wastewater study in partnership with the government of Nunavut. One of the conditions that we gave on their use of this facility was that they, number one, train us in use of some of their equipment, so we'll be able to do a much broader range of tests on water. We can test for nutrients now and other water quality parameters. And number two, that they leave at the end of their project the major equipment with us. So we'll have a reverse osmosis water treatment system, this new benchtop autoclave to add to our equipment. So those partnerships with academic institutions are critical to building our capacity, and they're mutually beneficial.
Thanks, Jamal. I'm going to jump to the other end of the spectrum.
Okay.
Now, your background as a science person, your understanding of the North and the importance of melding the tech and the local North. So you come up with results.
Yeah.
Right? And you find out that, you know, this water is not good for you folks. How do you communicate that to the community? How do you get them to accept the Western science aspect?
That's a really good question. Yeah.
Culture?
Well, I'd preface that by first saying that our results today have indicated probably the opposite, that the water from the streams that people collect drinking water from is very pristine. But again, having said that, what we stress in this particular project is that we are not a public health agency. We have no mandate and no right whatsoever to suggest to anybody that their drinking water is safe or clean or unsafe. Our complete focus is on building scientific expertise and capacity to run these tests. For communicating the results of this particular project, we work through the Department of Health. There's a public health, an environmental health officer whom we share all our results with. We share results of the city of Iqaluit and let them make their own determinations on what follow-up is needed, if they want to do advisories or if they want to do follow-up studies. We are not an accredited facility, so all our tests are done with those caveats. I'm completely confident in the accuracy of our results, but we don't have a national accreditation, and so we can't provide, testing for regulatory purposes. But that's sort of an aside. Communicating science in plain language to communities in Nunavut is an incredibly challenging and frustrating endeavor, and something we've never really gotten the handle of. In all my years working at the Institute, I've even co-published scientific journal articles looking at how research shouldn't be communicated, and I still don't consider myself anywhere near or to finding the answer than I was 10 years ago, simply because of this. No two people think the same way in any community. There are varied and conflicting views on the relevance and the value of science, and a range of levels of understanding and acceptance of science within a single community. One elder may be fascinated with research and really have a desire to communicate and dialogue with researchers and completely understand the technical material being presented, whereas his neighbor may have had a bad experience with a researcher years ago and want nothing to do with science, distrusts them, and sees no value at all in research and doesn't want to hear about it. So we have to acknowledge in efforts to communicate research results in the communities that we're actually speaking with multitudes of communities within a community, and accept that we're never going to reach everyone all the time, and that sometimes you have to tailor content and messages for specific target groups within the community, and even then it's not always effective. But the key challenge that we face in Nunavut is that of bridging a linguistic barrier to communicate very complex terminology. I mean, it's hard enough to explain a polychlorinated biphenyl in English. Imagine trying to translate that to Inuktitut. And the pressure that these interpreter translators feel in communities who have very little science training themselves, and they're expected to effectively communicate and translate very complex, abstract terms and concepts from one language and thought system into another. And oftentimes the process of interpreting actually involves defining and explaining. So we are incredibly indebted to interpreter translators in the communication process for science in Nunavut. And oftentimes a good interpreter means the difference between a good science communication and bad science communication. And we have acknowledged that for years and tried to develop resources and supports for our interpreter translators so that they can be effective intermediaries for science communication in Nunavut.
So you may have noticed that we're sort of notching this up as we're going along, because when you talk about complex, now let's get to one of the most complex ones that we know.
Okay.
So we're talking about climate change, global change.
Yeah.
What have been your experience? Because obviously you have your own feelings about this, and
Yeah.
you see the impacts around it. Can you tell us a little bit about sort of your challenges there and how you're...
Well, complexity is, I think, a very good catch-all phrase to describe climate change and how it's being understood and dealt with in Nunavut and probably in other jurisdictions as well. Because for the main challenge as I see it is that we really have very little understanding of what the current condition, what the baseline is, what the pre-climate change conditions are. No 2 years are the like. Variability in cycles and unpredictability are inherent in the Arctic environment and climate and in the Inuit people's understanding of it. And they've been lived with uncertainty and vulnerability and adapted to unpredictable changing conditions for so long that climate change as it's presented in the kind of global discourse sometimes is, people look at it as, well, so what, we've always adapted and will continue. But at the same time, there's mounting evidence of, changes that are beyond the range of variability that was experienced in the past, and large-scale changes in our systems and new vulnerabilities. But to me, I look at climate change in the context of change in general, technological, cultural. I think the upheaval that families and communities are experiencing as a result of the loss of traditional family connections and the loss of language and the sort of the uncertainty of being thrust into a modern world, like from writing dog teams to surfing the internet in the span of 40, 50 years has had a profound impact, and I think it far outweighs the impact of climate change on people. For example, if you look at the potential impacts of climate change on the vulnerability of Inuit hunters, which is a very common theme for research, a hunter skilled in traditional techniques and knowledge is far less vulnerable than someone without those skills and knowledge in the environment. But the person who the person who's working 9 to 5, who doesn't necessarily have time to learn traditional skills, has probably got the more economic means to be mobile and out on the land and practicing traditional activities. So it's very complex. In terms of the environment and wildlife, I think it's become so politicized, like the polar bear, for example, and now this icon of the impact of climate change in the north. And it's now a source of frustration for a lot of community members who argue that, the Arctic is being misused and misrepresented to further environmentalist agendas. And it's come to the point now where oftentimes when we want to broker a dialogue on a research project, we'll never mention climate change. Even if the research project is looking at the changing Arctic environment, climate change is a deal breaker now in some circles here, because people are sick of talking about it and hearing about it. But if you approach it through the lens of better understanding what's going on in the environment and topics and species and issues and areas and landscapes, and figuring out what the conditions are and how and why things are the way they are and are changing, and placing due importance on the vast knowledge of the Inuit with respect to the environment and the life history and ecology of our many species, and from bugs to plants to whales, you have much more success in engaging communities. There's a lot of research fatigue, though, I'll be quite honest. A lot of people have come up within the last few years to document the dramatic impacts of climate change on Inuit lifestyles, and to document evidence of climate change impacts on wildlife and landscapes. And people are just getting tired of telling the same story over and over and over again, and sort of withdrawing somewhat from the discourse. And it's now being seen more of as an economic activity. People want to do an interview for the honorarium rather than for the value of the information. So it's a complex, it's challenging. Sometimes I wish people would just stop and completely analyze everything we've collected to date before doing any new research on climate change. And other times I'm convinced that we need networks of data collectors out in every community documenting all the changing conditions. But I think with the opening of a new high Arctic research station in Cambridge Bay in the next coming years, there's going to have to be some serious thought about research priorities and how to address issues such as research fatigue and duplication, and to ensure that studies that are done out of that center are valuable and add to the knowledge base and meaningfully involve and consult with our residents.